Now this week's Parsha has a dual name, if we may call that. It's the Shabbat Tazria, which is part of the Chumash of Vayikra, and also it's Parashat Hachodesh. It happens to be the concluding Parsha of the Arba Parshas that take place before Pesach. We've already gone through the 4 Parshas, Shkolim, Zohar, last week was Porah, and now it's Parashat Hachodesh, and it comes out on Rosh Chodesh, on the first day of Nisan, and it's always the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, or on that itself. But I was going to focus only on, basically, on the text of Parashat Tazria to see whether there is a very relevant message there, although amongst Darshanim, whoever has to speak about the Parsha of Tazria or Mitzvah, it's very challenging, because especially Parashat Tazria has so many elements there that go beyond what seem to be practical application, especially in the major part of the Parsha, which talks about Negoyim, about the different manifestations, what has been translated as leprosy or skin diseases, different types of plague outbursts on different things, whether it's on a person's skin, or whether it's in the hair, whether it's in clothes, and next week's Seder is talking about buildings and so forth. However, the Seder starts with the idea of Tazria, of a woman becoming pregnant and having a child, and the child is described either as a male or female, and besides the obligation of having a bris on the 8th day, the Torah discusses the matters of tahara, of purification, which are preceded by periods of ritual, what we might call pollution, of tumah. And the male was 33 days, it was a 33-day, just a 7-day period of tumah, and then 33 days of tahara, and with a female it was double, 2 weeks of tumah and 66 days of tahara. But what happened in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, after purifying herself, the mother, the new mother, had to bring korbanos. She had to bring offerings to the Beis Hamikdash. One was an ola, and one was a chatos. That's the way it was brought out. So the question is, a chata, if it's a Thanksgiving offering, we could understand that she's gone through the throes of childbirth. As some Meforshim say, if this is an act of thanksgiving, it should be what we call a korban toda, a korban of acknowledgement of passing through the difficult process of birth, which is painful and all, and surviving and celebrating the birth of a child. But the very fact that the expression in the Torah does not mention toda, it says olah and chatos, and chatos implies sin. Person brings a korban chatos because there's some aspect of something wrong, a sin. What was the sin during the time of the birth? Now, Rashi has quoted a familiar medrash that is brought down and repeated, that at the time of the very difficult throes of childbirth, a woman who is suffering, has these terrible pains, or what we call the chevle leda. It varies on the person herself, but at that time, the way the language of Chazal is, kofetzes v'nishbas. She bursts out and swears she's never going to have a child again. She's never going to go back to her husband and have to go through this process. So the very fact that she uttered such a negative statement about the future of her family, she has to bring a korban chatos. She has to bring that type of a sin offering. That in itself is considered like a sin. That's the most familiar medrash. However, the question is also asked, what about this korban olah? And the fact that Gemara, the Talmud, asks in the Masechtas Zvachim that when you have a sin offering, when you have a korban chatos in the avoda, in the service of the Mikdash, the chatos was brought rishona. It was brought first. In other words, if several korbanos had to be brought, the chatos takes precedent. So here the Torah says, Es ha'ola ve'es ha'chatos. It mentions the ola and the chatos. And the Gemara in Zvachim does address itself to that particular question. So what's the response to that? So Rava, one of the great Amoraim, says that true, the chatos really is brought first because of this concept of the sin of her, what she said and what she stated, but the olah is only mentioned in the Chumash just to tell us as limikra, is to tell us there was some element there of maybe of sin which you had to bring a korban olah. Doesn't say why, that's only a statement, but in the actual service the chatos was brought first. So how do we understand all of this? It seems to be rather confusing and contradictory at the same time. What type of a relevant message is there for us in this era of discussing behavior or attitude or so forth? Now, there is a great sefer on the Chumash. It's in Drush, in homiletics, in commentary, the Yalkut Yehuda. The Yalkut Yehuda is one of the many svarim written by a great Rav who lived in Denver, Colorado, a Lithuanian Rav, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Ginsburg Zal. He wrote other svarim such as Musar HaMishnah, Musar HaNeviim, and so forth, on various aspects of the Mishnayos, and of course on Chumash Yalkut Yehuda. He says there are three stages in a person's mind and verbalization and action. In other words, there's such a thing as a stage of machshava, what goes on in a person's mind, what he's thinking. And then there is dibur, which we are familiar with means expression. The person verbalizes maybe what he's thinking. And then there's maisa and deed. In principle, a korban chatos for doing a bad deed unintentionally, there is a korban chatos. A person in the time of the Beis Hamikdash had to bring a chatos, which was an atonement, an expiation, a kapara. Now, and here we have the case of the woman, the way it's explained, because she uttered such a thing, such a negative thing, is almost like a deed, so she brings a chatos. What about machshava? What about the thought? Because what happens before a person verbalizes something just doesn't come out and makes a statement. They were thinking, whatever that statement was, they were thinking about it beforehand. Their mind was filled with the verbalization, or to go further, with the action that took place later. So what was going on in her mind? In other words, even in her mind, before she expressed about not going back to live with her husband and so forth, she, in the pain, she was thinking, I can't do this, I'm not going to do this. That was a machshava. So for machshava, there's a korban olah. That's the idea of the korban olah. There has to be some atonement for the korban olah, although it was not an actual deed. So what the Torah is telling us, that any deed that is done, or even an expression, a bad expression, a negative expression, had to be preceded by a mind that was filled with negative thoughts. It just doesn't happen by itself. For example, I could give an example where the Talmud says at the end of Masechta Sukkah, what a shuta the yanuka bashuk is oda avua oda ima. The expression of a child in the street, what a child says, comes from the father or the mother. If a child is raised in a negative attitude towards other people, or if a child, let's say, is nurtured in a surrounding of division, of conflict, or even of profanity, the child in the street will utter that because his mind has already been filled, so later on he'll come out with it. So what the Torah is telling us here is, if a person fills his mind with negative attitudes, that in itself is a sin. The machshava is sinful. So in the case of this case, very delicate area of birth and of statement about the future, if the woman has already filled her mind with a negative attitude, there is this korban olah that should be an expiation. Now, what is the lesson gained from that? I would think that many of the historical situations, and it's quite true today, perhaps those who are familiar with that totalitarian dictatorships and so forth, they used the great means of what was known as propaganda, or later on they used the term brainwashing. They can take thousands and even millions of people. If they control the media and fill their minds with animosity towards certain values, which to them are those values which are very negative, which are destructive, or they fill their minds to raise their level of hate towards other people. So although their minds are only filled with that, if it comes to doing any action or expression against those who are the targets of that hatred, of that enmity, they will come out with it because their minds have been filled with that. That filling of the mind is a very sinful act, very negative. If children are raised, for example, in a attitude or in an atmosphere of hatred towards certain groups or certain people, or how to get along with people, when they go out in the street, they will first, their minds have so been filled, that's the cause of their verbal expressions. So what the Torah is telling us, that even for the machshava, for the thought, that is not proper. You would have to bring in principle, a korban olah, although it's not in the category of what we call a sinful offering. And today, we live in a world of great extremism. For example, all these things that are perpetrated in the Near East and spread all over the world, like ISIS, and which attach itself to religion of Islam, they have trained their people, brainwashed them and so forth, to hate anybody who's not of their religion, to the extent where though it's only taught in a school and the people, our minds are filled with that particular hatred, later on they will carry out into action. It will be destructive, and we see what happens. People, they become, from just being taught certain things, they become terrorists. They become the vehicles of annihilation, of destruction, of lack of any tolerance for anybody else. So the Torah, in a simple way, just in this case of childbirth, is trying to tell us that even in the most extreme circumstances, a person should try to fill their mind with good thoughts, with positive thoughts. We know that in law there's a difference between, in the act of murder, of committing that capital crime, the courts make a distinction between premeditated and just an emotional outburst. Premeditated murder gets the worst punishment because it's been planned. Person has filled his mind, how is he going to destroy this other individual? If it's just an emotional outburst, it might be called in law manslaughter. They'll give a lighter sentence, whatever it is. What I would say the Torah is trying to tell us in this message about what happens here, the result of could be a korban olah, it's good to fill your mind with premeditated goodness. Children, an atmosphere should be fostered of avos habrios, of love of other people, of tolerating other people, of being able to live with other people, and not to develop negative ideas. And once a person can get control of his mind, then you don't have to worry about the type of statements a person is going to make or the type of action he's going to make. And I would say that the Parsha of Chodesh Hazeh Lechem, this month, the Torah says, is yours. And we're talking within the context of redemption, of the Jewish people being sort of resurrected out of slavery, also as a message within the framework of the Sedra, the few thoughts I have uttered, that HaChodesh, if you want to be Mechadish, your life, your mind, your words, your expressions, and even your actions, you should do Lechem. You should take control of it, and you have the power to do that. That's what the Torah is trying to tell us, And once you do that, then you will machshava tova, a good thought. The Talmud says in Kedushin and Daf Mem, mitzvah l'maisa. HaKadosh Baruch Hu considers even the good thought part later on. If a person does a good deed, he attaches to it the good thoughts that preceded that. That's almost an extension of the Maisa. You're rewarded for not only the deed per se, but even for the good intention. And sometimes even when you can't fulfill the Maisa, the good deed, the good attitude is worth a great deal as far as human relationships are concerned, and certainly towards the Almighty. May Hashem grant that this Chodesh, this coming month, the coming Pesach, should be Lechem, and we should ultimately be able to celebrate a Chag Kosher V'Sameach, Ubias Gold Tzedek B'Mheir B'Yameinu. Amen.